At a production plant in Taebaek, Gangwon Province, a young, dumb, disgusting, lonely gremlin named Gavin Kang was working while handling packages. During his shift, one of the baddie managers called him over. As soon as he approached, she began scolding him, explaining that she had just received a call informing her that the packages meant to be sent to Jongno had mistakenly been shipped to Busan instead. She demanded an explanation for the error. Gavin immediately apologized while listening to her complaints like a good boy. As she continued shouting at him, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He thought about how he was just an ordinary man named Gavin Kang, nothing more than a factory worker living in the countryside. Although he hated living such a life, he knew he had little choice. The factory was located far away from any major city, in a place filled with memories he would rather forget, and jobs like this were the only ones available to him. Despite his dissatisfaction with work, he felt that the rest of his life was not entirely terrible. A few days earlier, however, something very strange had started happening to him. He had begun seeing numbers floating above people's chests. The only thing he had managed to figure out was that the numbers usually ranged from 3 to 30. Beyond that, he had no idea what they meant. The manager's voice suddenly interrupted his thoughts as she demanded to know whether he had been listening to her. After finishing her lecture, she ordered him to return to work. Gavin quickly agreed and went back to his duties. As he resumed working, he continued thinking about the mysterious numbers. Considering how much the manager seemed to dislike him, he found it strange that the number on her chest was only 3. Most people around him displayed numbers ranging from 10 to 30. No matter how much he thought about it, he could not figure out their meaning. At first, he suspected that they represented some kind of interest level, but since he could not make any practical use of that information, the phenomenon only frustrated him even more. After completing his shift, Gavin returned to his apartment. Feeling exhausted, he thought about how troublesome his new ability had become. Being able to see mysterious numbers on people's chests was completely useless and only made him worry even more. He wondered whether he would ever be able to live a normal life again. As he was about to enter his apartment building, he noticed his beautiful neighbor standing nearby. She greeted him casually. The sight of her immediately made him nervous, and before he could gather the courage to say anything meaningful, the opportunity had already passed. As he watched her leave, he remembered the number he had seen on her chest. Unlike everyone else, her number had been 89. It was the highest number he had ever seen. The discovery only deepened his confusion. If his theory about the numbers representing interest levels was correct, then the result made absolutely no sense. There was no way a woman as attractive as her could possibly be interested in someone like him. Gavin could not remember any woman ever showing romantic interest in him. The only woman who had consistently cared about him throughout his life was his mother. Yet if the number truly represented interest, and if her feelings were somehow directed toward him, then perhaps she might ask him out someday. The thought of going on a date with someone like her felt incredible. A moment later, he realized that he had been daydreaming. Even in his own fantasies, he knew such a thing could never happen. More than anything, he wanted to understand the real reason those mysterious numbers kept appearing on people. The next day, Gavin decided to visit the local cinema. He often watched movies because the numbers never appeared on people on the screen, which gave him some peace of mind. The theater itself was located in the middle of nowhere, and he often wondered how it managed to stay in business. Still, he liked the fact that very few people ever came there. The quiet atmosphere helped him focus on the movie. While watching the film, he suddenly noticed a couple sitting in a distant corner of the theater. They seemed completely focused on each other and were engaging in a fitness conditioning session. Gavin was surprised because it had been a long time since he had encountered anyone else inside the theater. What caught his attention even more were the numbers displayed on the couple's chests. Unlike usual, the numbers appeared to be increasing. Watching them closely made him wonder if the numbers truly represented desire rather than simple interest. The possibility shocked him. That night, after returning to his apartment building, he continued thinking about what he had seen. If the 89 on his neighbor's chest represented interest, then it did not make sense. The numbers he had observed on the couple in the theater had not even reached that level, despite their obvious attraction to each other. His neighbor, on the other hand, had looked perfectly calm and normal. The situation simply did not add up. As he entered the elevator, he found the same neighbor standing inside. She appeared nervous and somewhat confused. Gavin hoped he was not imagining things. Deciding that there was no harm in being polite, he greeted her. Before she could properly respond, however, she quickly stepped out of the elevator. Watching her leave, Gavin immediately assumed that she probably thought he was some kind of strange or creepy man. After arriving home, he reflected further on his theory. Perhaps the numbers represented levels of interest or desire after all. If his assumptions were correct, and the scale ranged from 1 to 100, then even a score above 50 seemed extremely high. Thinking about the couple in the theater, he felt that their numbers should have been enough to drive them toward intense physical desire, yet his neighbor's number had been far higher than theirs. The idea seemed impossible, At the same time, he admitted that it was perfectly predictable and pathetic for him to assume that a woman like her would never be interested in a loser like himself. He wondered whether he should try asking her out. If he had never known about the numbers, he probably would not have even considered approaching her. Now, however, the mystery constantly occupied his thoughts. Even the idea of speaking to her frightened him, but he convinced himself that he might try the following day. Deep down, he doubted that he would actually be able to do it. Still, he felt that this might be the only chance he would ever get. Meanwhile, on the other side of the building, the neighbor had just finished taking a shower and was doing wrist curl exercises in her apartment when her door camera alerted her to someone outside. Looking at the monitor, she saw Gavin standing in front of her door. Outside, Gavin was struggling with his nerves. Right up until the moment he had reached her apartment, he had managed to stay calm. All he needed to do was press the doorbell. It was a simple action that anyone could accomplish without difficulty. However, as soon as he stood there, panic began overwhelming him once again. He reasoned that such a reaction was probably normal for a 25-year-old man who had never been in a relationship. The truth was that he did not even know what he planned to say. He considered asking her about the fitness training session he had seen earlier, but immediately realized how strange that would sound. In fact, he doubted she would even open the door after seeing someone like him standing outside through the intercom. If he was lucky, she would simply ignore him. If he was unlucky, she might even call the police and report that a suspicious stranger was lingering outside her apartment. As these thoughts raced through his mind, Gavin realized how ridiculous he was being. Then, without warning, the door suddenly opened. Standing before him was his neighbor. The moment he looked at her, his eyes instinctively moved to the number floating above her chest. The number now displayed a perfect 100. The sight left him completely stunned. The neighbor looked at Gavin and immediately noticed the confused expression on his face. Seeing that he was simply standing there without saying anything, she told him that if he had nothing to say, she was going to go back inside her apartment. Her words instantly made Gavin panic. Before she could turn around and close the door, he quickly stopped her and began apologizing awkwardly. As the words left his mouth, he could feel an overwhelming pressure building inside his chest. His heart was beating uncontrollably, and he felt as though every second was becoming more difficult than the last. Deep down, he thought that he was already terrified just trying to speak to her, let alone gathering the courage to ask her out. While standing there, he looked at her more carefully and realized that she seemed as though she had been busy exercising before he arrived. Trying desperately to think of something that would not sound strange, he searched for the right words but could not find any. In his nervousness, he suddenly blurted out that he wanted to have a bowl of tea with her. The unexpected request completely surprised her. For a brief moment, she simply stared at him as though she was trying to understand whether he was serious. Then she suddenly burst into laughter. Watching her laugh made Gavin even more embarrassed than before. He immediately started apologizing again and felt as though he had completely ruined any chance of having a normal conversation with her. Feeling ashamed of himself, he prepared to leave and thought that he had probably made himself look ridiculous. However, just as he was about to walk away, she stopped him. To his complete surprise, she casually agreed and told him that they could have tea inside her apartment. Gavin could hardly believe what he had just heard. For a moment, he wondered whether he had misunderstood her. When he realized that she was serious, he nervously followed her inside. The moment he entered her home, countless thoughts began racing through his mind. He realized that it was the first time in his entire life that he had ever entered a woman's apartment. His heart was beating so loudly that he felt as though she would be able to hear it from across the room. Everything around him felt unfamiliar. The apartment smelled pleasant and clean, and he immediately assumed that the scent came from the perfume she used. As he sat there quietly, he could not stop observing his surroundings. Meanwhile, she went into the kitchen and began preparing tea. While waiting for her to return, Gavin tried to calm himself down, but his nervousness only continued growing. Every passing second made him more aware of the fact that he was alone inside a woman's apartment for the first time in his life. After preparing the tea, she returned and placed it in front of him. She then asked him why he had suddenly wanted to drink tea with her. The question immediately made him nervous again. As he looked at her, his attention was drawn toward the mysterious number that had been bothering him ever since he first noticed it. He found himself thinking that her desire level had remained unusually high since the previous day. If his theory about the numbers was actually correct, then she must have been putting an incredible amount of effort into remaining calm. The possibility only made him more confused than before. As these thoughts occupied his mind, she continued waiting for an answer. When he remained silent for too long, she asked him again, clearly expecting him to explain the real reason he had come to her apartment. Eventually, their conversation continued, and before he realized it, she unexpectedly suggested that they spend time together doing a high-intensity cardio training session. Although Gavin was initially hesitant and unsure how to respond, he eventually agreed. The following morning, Gavin arrived at work feeling completely exhausted. The moment he started working at the production plant, it became obvious that something was wrong with him. His movements were slower than usual, his concentration was poor, and he constantly looked distracted. One of his co-workers observed him for a while before finally deciding to confront him. She pointed out that he looked extremely strange while working, and told him that at his current pace, he would never finish his assigned tasks. She sarcastically asked whether he was planning to spend the entire night at the factory, because he certainly was not working fast enough to leave on time. Gavin immediately apologized and admitted that he was feeling tired that day. However, instead of showing sympathy, his co-worker began scolding him even more. She complained that he was constantly interfering with other people's work, and warned him that his slow pace was going to put the entire staff behind schedule. She reminded him that the factory was already short-staffed, and that everyone had to properly handle their responsibilities if they wanted to complete the workload. Gavin quietly listened to everything she said and simply agreed. His co-worker then demanded to know whether he was actually going to work or continue standing around. She warned him that if he failed to finish his tasks, he would not even get a lunch break that day. Once again, Gavin quietly agreed and returned to his duties. As he resumed working, he could not stop thinking about how strange everything felt. He wondered whether his exhaustion was affecting his judgment and making him see things differently. After all, he had spent practically the entire night engaged in an intense cardiovascular training session, leaving him completely drained. Every part of his body ached from fatigue. His muscles felt sore, his energy was gone, and even simple movements felt difficult. Suddenly, memories from the previous night began replaying inside his mind. He remembered being inside his neighbor's apartment, remembered their conversation, and remembered every small detail that had happened. The more he thought about her, the more distracted he became. Before long, he found himself completely lost in fantasies involving the neighbor. His thoughts continued wandering until he finally forced himself to focus on his work again. After eventually finishing his shift, Gavin returned home feeling even more exhausted than before. When he entered the apartment building, he discovered that fate seemed determined to place them together once again. The neighbor was already standing inside the elevator. The moment he saw her, his heart immediately reacted. As the elevator doors closed, he prepared himself to greet her. He thought that at the very least he should say hello. However, before he could even open his mouth, he noticed something that completely caught him off guard. Instead of acknowledging him warmly, she appeared to be deliberately avoiding him. She was giving him the cold shoulder. The unexpected reaction instantly shocked him because it was the last thing he had expected after everything that had happened between them the previous night. He stood there in confusion, unable to understand why her attitude had suddenly changed. The situation left him completely surprised and uncertain about what he was supposed to do next. Gavin stood there in confusion as he watched his neighbor walk past him as though he did not exist. As the elevator doors closed and she continued ignoring him, countless thoughts began racing through his mind. He thought that his pathetic brain had spent 25 years constantly expecting the worst possible outcome in every situation. Now, after everything that had happened recently, it seemed determined to convince him that every hopeful thought he had ever entertained was nothing more than a foolish fantasy. He tried to convince himself that there was no point dwelling on it any longer. After all, he had gathered his courage the previous day and taken a chance, and something good had actually come from it. Remembering that, he decided not to give up immediately. He stepped closer to her and directly asked whether she was really ignoring him. His sudden question clearly surprised her, but despite her reaction, she once again chose not to answer. Instead, she continued acting as though he was not there. Seeing no point in pushing further, Gavin eventually returned to his apartment. Once inside, he threw himself onto his bed and spent the rest of the evening overthinking the entire situation. Every possible explanation crossed his mind. He wondered whether he had said something wrong, whether he had misunderstood her intentions, or whether she regretted everything that had happened between them. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. By the time he finally fell asleep, his mind was completely exhausted. The next day, Gavin went to work as usual. He arrived at the production plant 10 minutes earlier than normal and immediately started working without speaking to anyone. His co-workers quickly noticed the unusual behavior. One of them observed him for a while before approaching him. Despite the fact that he had arrived early, she began questioning him and complaining about his performance. While Gavin quietly apologized, she continued scolding him. She told him that she did not care what kind of problems he had been dealing with lately, because she had already warned him not to let his personal issues affect his work. As Gavin listened, he could not help feeling frustrated. In his mind, he pointed out that this was the first time he had been late in the entire year and a half that he had worked there. Yet, she did not seem interested in hearing any explanation. The thought irritated him more than he wanted to admit. For a brief moment, he imagined himself finally speaking his mind. He imagined telling her that she constantly interfered in his business and criticized every little thing he did. He imagined saying that nothing she ever said was helpful, and that there was not a single person in the world who could possibly enjoy being around someone like her. In his imagination, his words left her completely stunned. However, those thoughts never actually left his head. Instead of saying any of them aloud, Gavin lowered his head and apologized once again. He promised that it would not happen again and assured her that he had taken her advice seriously. He then asked whether she would be willing to extend his hours because he wanted to work overtime. His request immediately changed her attitude. She told him that he had always done good work and that she would be more than happy to give him additional hours. Gavin simply thanked her and agreed. After the conversation ended, he reflected on what had happened. He realized that he was angry and frustrated, but he also admitted that some of her criticism was justified. In a strange way, she had forced him to look at his situation more realistically. As he continued working, he convinced himself that the best thing he could do was focus entirely on his job. He decided that he would work harder than ever and forget about everything that had happened with his neighbor. The memories, the confusion, and all the emotions attached to them would simply be treated like a dream. He told himself that it was time to wake up and return to reality. 5 days passed. One afternoon, Gavin was outside near the playground in front of his apartment building. As he stood there enjoying the pleasant weather, he thought that it might be nice to go for a walk after taking a shower later. While looking around, he suddenly noticed his neighbor, already sitting nearby. She appeared to be waiting for someone. She was dressed beautifully, and the moment their eyes met, Gavin felt his heart react. Instinctively, he wanted to avoid the situation entirely. He immediately turned around and hurried back to his apartment. Once inside, he sat down to eat dinner while trying to calm himself. He thought about how hard he had worked over the past 5 days to forget about her. Yet the moment he saw her again, all those feelings immediately returned. Seeing her reminded him of everything he had been trying to leave behind. He convinced himself that she was probably waiting for someone else. In his imagination, the person she was waiting for was probably some incredibly confident and attractive man. The thought made Gavin feel even worse. Even so, simply thinking about her still gave him butterflies in his stomach. While he was lost in those thoughts, someone suddenly knocked on his door. Gavin assumed that it was probably the gas company employee coming to perform another routine inspection. Without giving it much thought, he checked the security camera. The moment he looked at the screen, he froze. Standing outside his door was his neighbor. His mind immediately went blank. For a moment, he could not even process what he was seeing. Countless, useless thoughts rushed through his head, but none of them seemed important anymore. Whether it was a miracle or pure coincidence no longer mattered. At that exact moment, the only thing he could clearly feel was overwhelming happiness. The emotion completely took over him. Without hesitating, he rushed toward the door. In his excitement, he did not even realize that he was not properly dressed. The moment he opened the door, he noticed that he was not wearing a shirt. Embarrassed, he immediately told her that he would go and get one. Before he could do that, however, he also noticed that she was dressed very casually herself. She then stepped inside his apartment. After entering, she told him that she wanted to spend time with him, doing another fat-burning cardio training session. Faced with her unexpected request, Gavin eventually agreed. The next morning, Gavin slowly woke up and found Heather standing in the kitchen. Heather informed him that she had prepared some ramen for him and told him that he should eat before doing anything else. Seeing the confusion on his face, she casually added that he could go back to sleep after finishing the meal if he was still tired. She also mentioned that she had already eaten, so he did not need to worry about her. Gavin remained silent for a moment as he stared at the cup of noodles in front of him. Deep down, he could not remember the last time someone had gone out of their way to prepare food for him. It was nothing more than a simple cup of ramen, yet the fact that Heather had prepared it specifically for him made him feel unexpectedly happy. As he sat there eating, he could not stop thinking about how unusual the situation felt. He had spent so much of his life taking care of himself that even a small gesture like this felt significant. While he was lost in those thoughts, Heather told him that she had been thinking about something. She explained that ever since they met, they had spent most of their time focused entirely on their workout sessions and had never really taken the time to talk to each other properly. After saying that, she introduced herself and said that her name was Heather Kim. Gavin responded by introducing himself as Gavin Kang. Although they had finally exchanged names, the atmosphere between them remained somewhat awkward. Gavin could still feel the distance between them despite the conversation. As he continued eating, he found himself thinking that once he finished his food, Heather would probably leave and return home. It was at that moment that he truly realized how awkward things became whenever they were not exercising together. During their workout sessions, they always had something to focus on, but outside of that, neither of them really knew anything about the other person. The realization bothered him because they had already spent so much time together without learning even the most basic details about one another. Those thoughts stayed with him long after the conversation ended. After Heather left, he lay down intending to get some sleep, but his mind refused to settle. One particular thought continued repeating itself over and over. He wondered whether Heather would have behaved differently around him if he had been a cooler, more confident person. The more he thought about it, the stronger his desire to change himself became. He wanted to become someone better, someone who could stand beside her without feeling inadequate. Because of those thoughts, he found himself unable to fall asleep, no matter how hard he tried. Later that same day, at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, Gavin arrived at the warehouse where he worked. It was supposed to be his day off, but he had been called in because there was an overwhelming amount of work that needed to be completed. The moment he entered the warehouse and looked around, he felt exhausted before he had even started. There were pallets everywhere, and the amount of work waiting for him seemed endless. As he stared at the massive workload, he found himself wondering whether he was really expected to handle all of it by himself. The sight alone was enough to drain his motivation. While he was looking around, one of his coworkers approached him and reassured him that the work was not as bad as it looked. She explained that the packages were not particularly heavy, and that they would probably finish everything fairly quickly. She told him that she would handle the sorting process, and that all he needed to do was separate the items onto the correct pallets. Since they had done this kind of work many times before, she believed they would be finished in no time if they worked efficiently. Gavin agreed with her, but there was something else on his mind. He wanted to ask why they seemed to be the only people working there. However, he immediately remembered how things had gone the last time he asked questions that did not concern him. Remembering that experience, he decided it was probably better to stay quiet and focus on his work. As he continued thinking, he considered asking for additional working hours. Eventually, he called out to Miss Park, intending to bring it up. However, the moment he got her attention, he lost all confidence. Before he could say what he wanted, he quickly claimed that it was nothing and returned to work. In reality, there were many things he wanted to say. He wanted to complain about having to work overtime. He wanted to point out that the pay was nowhere near enough to justify the extra effort. He wanted to express how frustrated he was about being called in on his day off. Yet, none of those words actually came out. When Miss Park asked him whether he had something to say, he simply replied that he did not and said that he was going back to work. Internally, however, he continued grumbling. It was obvious that they would be stuck there for hours. The fact that he was spending his weekend at the warehouse instead of resting irritated him more and more the longer he thought about it. Not long afterward, another coworker named Eugene Cho arrived at the warehouse. The moment he appeared, he complained that he had answered Miss Park's call and was already regretting it. He joked that he should have turned his phone off and pretended not to notice the call. Hearing that, both he and Gavin immediately realized that they had ended up there for exactly the same reason. After their brief conversation, they got back to work. The next several hours passed with the three of them focusing on the workload. Although Gavin had no desire to spend his weekend working, he had to admit that the job itself was progressing smoothly. Since most of the packages were relatively light, the work moved faster than he had expected. While they were working, Gavin became curious and asked Eugene why he had been called in when he normally worked on line 1. Before Eugene had the chance to answer, Miss Park suddenly appeared and asked who had placed a pallet onto the forklift. Eugene immediately admitted that he was responsible. The moment he answered, Miss Park began criticizing him. She pointed out that the pallet had not been wrapped properly and suggested that he had probably loaded it carelessly without paying enough attention. As Gavin listened to the conversation, he found himself anticipating what would happen next. Based on everything he knew about Miss Park, he expected her to continue criticizing Eugene because she disliked people acting without being completely certain of what they were doing. Miss Park proceeded to lecture Eugene about the importance of safety. She reminded him that the first rule of the job was safety, and that the second rule was also safety. She explained that even though wrapping pallets might seem like a simple task, mistakes could create serious problems and potentially cause accidents. Watching Eugene get scolded so harshly, Gavin eventually decided to speak up. He commented that he thought Eugene already understood his mistake. Miss Park immediately turned her attention toward him and replied that if she ignored mistakes like this, people would simply repeat them in the future. Gavin responded by pointing out that they had come to help on their day off. He explained that he did not think she was being particularly fair to them. He also added that Eugene was not even assigned to her line. Miss Park quickly challenged him by asking whether he would personally take responsibility if something went wrong. She reminded him that he was not a manager and pointed out that she certainly did not remember promoting him to such a position. She then told him to focus on his own responsibilities instead of interfering with hers. Before Gavin could respond, Miss Park threw her glove at his face and told him that if he was going to defend mistakes, then he should have ensured they never happened in the first place. The sudden action completely caught him off guard. Startled, he immediately began apologizing. Miss Park warned him that mistakes should never be taken lightly, and that anyone involved needed to be prepared to accept responsibility for them. After delivering her final warning, she walked away. As Gavin watched her leave, he could not help thinking that she had an incredibly short temper. Once she was gone, Eugene turned toward Gavin and told him that he was amazing. He admitted that he could never have spoken to her the way Gavin just had. Gavin responded by explaining that he simply did not think it was right for her to yell at someone who was not even part of her department. Eugene seemed impressed by the explanation and commented that Gavin had actually stood up to the boss's daughter. Hearing those words instantly shocked Gavin. His surprise was so obvious that Eugene laughed and remarked that he was acting as though he had never known. Eugene explained that everyone in the warehouse knew she was the boss's daughter, and that most people would never dare challenge her because of it. He then began sharing additional information about her. According to Eugene, she had graduated from one of the best universities in the country. After that, she earned a master's degree and even studied abroad. Apparently, she had once considered pursuing a PhD before eventually deciding to work at the warehouse instead. Eugene also mentioned that there had been many rumors surrounding her return. Some people claimed that she had experienced problems involving a man while she was overseas and that her father had forced her to come back. Whether the rumors were true or not, Eugene did not know. However, he had heard them repeatedly from different people. He also mentioned that many employees either quit or were fired shortly after working under her supervision. Gavin listened carefully as he processed all of the information. Everything Eugene was saying was completely new to him. Eugene jokingly remarked that if Gavin ended up getting fired because of what happened earlier, he would at least buy him a good meal. Gavin laughed and insisted that there was no way anyone would be fired over something as minor as a pallet wrapping mistake. Nevertheless, his attention gradually shifted toward Miss Park. As he observed her from a distance, he found himself wondering why she was spending her weekend working so hard if she really was the boss's daughter. Most people in her position would not have bothered showing up at all.